Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Hey, welcome everybody to the latest edition of the FFToolbox podcast, coming to you live Tuesday, a little bit earlier than we do it normally. It's 7 o'clock. I've got a draft to get to later, so, the price you pay for doing too many drafts. You sometimes got to move shows around, but fortunately, my boy George Bissell was able to hop on. I gave Brian the week off so he could rest his choppers over there because he's been talking so long in a good way for helping me out here for weeks and weeks. And we got to get George. George is a bit of a training camp holdout for us, so we got to get him up to speed for the regular season. Before we get to George, before we talk later about what's the latest on Michael Vick, on Mike Wallace, and others, just a reminder, we are, of course, sponsored by DynastyOwner.com. Go there, check them out. New formatting on how to do the fantasy football world. They only have a relative amount of spots available, so go there, check them out at DynastyOwner.com. You guys have heard me talk about them a bunch on here. George, let's just jump right into this. I was trying to think what to talk about. We've gone through all the positions, and I was thinking about it as I was going through some some readers' questions on Facebook and on the mailbox at podcast@fftoolbox.com. And the most basic question you get there, and I get out in the real world, I'm sure you do as well, is, so what are your rankings on this guy? Where do you have this guy ranked? What do you think? Who do you like more between this guy and that guy? And questions along those lines. And what sort of struck me about the whole thing when it comes to rankings, if I just say, well, I personally think, Michael Vick is the number 6 quarterback, or FF Toolbox has him number 6, whatever, then if I give out no other information, they think, okay, well, he's the number 6 quarterback. If the top 5 guys go and I think I need a quarterback, boom, take Michael Vick, right? But to me, I think we need next year maybe, I'm going to push to have some sort of an arrow indicator on our rankings that go up or down, because a guy like Vick, who, if you did, for those of you who are catching this maybe live now or haven't been up to date on what's going on in football, Michael Vick and the Eagles played Monday night against Georgia's Patriots. Not surprisingly, Michael Vick took a big hit because that's what he does. He doesn't seem to like to get out of harm's way, and got knocked out of the game. Reports today he's got a minor rib injury. I mean, nothing is going to keep him out of the lineup, or at least not out of week 1 of the NFL season. But this is the fear with him, and the question, I guess, is, what's your ultimate risk tolerance for certain guys? Because it's not just a matter of where they're ranked, but it's like, do you actually want to deal with that? And so, George, let's just start right there with Michael Vick. Like I said, he's probably number 6 on our board. I think that's probably reasonable, because with his potential, with his run-pass combination, if he can make it through most of the year, play most of the games, it wouldn't surprise any of us, I don't think, if he's in one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in fantasy, and thus one of the handful of best players in the league. But there's a lot that goes with having that guy. Is he the kind of guy that you want to hang your hat on this year?
Oh, I kind of was really high on Michael Vick last year. I don't know if you remember, around this time last year, I said, you should take Vick number 1. You should, as soon as you can, if you have the ability to get him, I would get him. And I live by my own advice, and I suffered through last season along with a lot of other Michael Vick owners. And, that's the risk you take. I mean, any player could get injured at any given time. Doesn't matter who you are. The best example of that is Tom Brady when he went down in week 1 back a couple of years ago. I want to say it was 2008, but it could happen to anybody, but it just feels like with Michael Vick, you're always going to be dealing with an injury issue thanks to his style of play. So that's something you got to take into account before you draft him. It really depends on where Vick goes in the draft. Like you were talking about earlier, it's really, do I want to take the risk on this guy, and is it worth it? And I think to go by your rankings, you have to have a tier system. And it depends what you think Vick's upside is versus, the downside and how much risk you're willing to take there. So I think if he's still sitting there in the 4th or 5th round, I have to seriously think about it if I don't have a quarterback. Obviously, if I get a Brady or Rodgers, Breeze, Cam Newton even. I'm not worried about Michael Vick. I'm not even thinking about it. But, I think he's a pretty solid bet given the upside, but you got to think he's going to miss at least 3 games this year, right off the top. So it's definitely a risk, and I think if he's the last guy in my tier and there's a drop-off, I'm going to reach and take him if I don't have a guy already. But you got to take a lot of risk in taking Michael Vick. I wouldn't feel good about it unless it were the 4th or 5th round. And even then, you're kind of reaching and hoping the upside plays out.
So here's my thinking on this. It's not just. Let's just suppose. And George, if you got your computer handy, you can look up his ADP. I forgot to do that during the show. If not, I'll do it. But relatively speaking, Michael Vick is going to go in the 4th round, 5th round. I guess it just sort of depends on the draft. He could go, depending on scoring, could go earlier or later. Just assume for these purposes, we're talking about 12-team standard scoring leagues. It's not just that you're spending that pick on him. If I'm drafting Michael Vick, I'm not going to wait that long to get a backup quarterback. I'm not saying I'm going to draft another quarterback the next round, but I'm not going to wait till the 12th the way I might if I draft Tom Brady or Drew Brees or a guy like Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Eli Manning, 3 guys who have pretty late buys, so I can kind of wait and see what happens. I kind of have to. I feel like you have to invest another quarterback relatively early on Vick, so that's another part of the equation when it comes to do I want to deal with this guy. The other thing is, like you said, I suffered through him last year, and depending on the size of your league, I'm in a league it's only a 14-man roster, so I had to constantly juggle my roster all year to deal with not only Vick but the backup quarterback, and then at one point the backup I had, I think it was, well, it doesn't matter, I don't remember who it was, but regardless, the quarterback had a bye week while Vick was out, so then I had to get another quarterback. And there's so much that goes on with him. I guess in the end of the day, I've moved down on Vick. I agree he's ranked 6th, but my hope is that I don't want to say like I'm just going to flat out not take him because in the heat of the moment, I can't honestly sit here and say that I wouldn't. But my ideal hope is that somebody else takes him so that I can wait and get. If I haven't already taken a Rodgers or a Brady, and people who've been listening to this know that I'm advocating taking a quarterback early. But when it comes to a guy like Vick, I think I'm gonna wait and get for somebody else. I actually just did a draft where Vick was on the board. I needed a quarterback. I saw that the people behind me needed a quarterback. I was able to finagle a trade down, knowing because I didn't want Vick, praying that somebody would take him. So I traded down, got other picks, to move up elsewhere. And sure enough, somebody took Vick, and then I took Matt Ryan coming back. That's about as dorky as you can get to avoid taking a guy, but. For me, I think that's kind of how I want to look at this. Now let's stay with the quarterbacks, George. Go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, you asked me about the average position for Vick. If you go to FFToolbox.com, I'm a company man, and look at the average draft position, Vick's 36th right now, so that's right at the start of the 4th round. And like I was saying, I don't really feel good about Vick, and I can't justify taking him. Until the late 4th, or if he slips to the 5th even due to the injury concerns, then I think I'd feel good about it. It's really hard to pass him up. There isn't another player in that range, I think, that could single-handedly win your league if he goes off. Right behind him we have Ahmad Bradshaw, Des Bryant, Michael Turner, Frank Gore, Mike Wallace, Steve Smith of Carolina. Vick has the most upside out of anybody in that group, so it's certainly justifiable taking him, but just a lot of risk there involved with Vick, more so than any of those other guys. I think that's why he's slipping into the 4th now.
And for what it's worth, there, if I've already drafted, let's say Ray Rice and AJ Green, right? And now we're coming to the next turn. Those are pretty 2 solid guys without any injury concern right now. Maybe I'd go with the risk on Vick. If I've drafted, MJD. Maybe let's take him. If I've drafted a guy like Darren McFadden and then say Ryan Matthews, I'm done with my risk. I'm not going for another guy who might be out. At least that's sort of where my risk tolerance lies. I'll go riskier later in the draft, but not so much so early. All right, but let me ask you this, because I don't know if we talked about this with you last week. I know Brian and I talked about this a lot during the summer. The notion of, in general, do you draft a quarterback early, or do you draft a quarterback, or do you wait on quarterback? And obviously historic norm is wait on a quarterback, for all, we all know the reasons kind of why. But the last year or two, I've been sort of going the other way, and when possible, have taken a quarterback early, specifically Aaron Rodgers, in the first round. And I think this year, the way things are breaking down with the running backs, where there's a lot of uncertainty after the first three or so guys, Rodgers, Brady, and Drew Brees are all looking like potential first-round picks, depending on your scoring, maybe even Matthew Stafford, maybe even Cam Newton, just depends. But here's my question. Just for 2012 specific, because Brian was one of those guys who said he would wait. I don't want to. Well, you've heard him. Everybody's heard him talk about this. I'm not saying anything that he hasn't already said. He wanted to wait, even relatively speaking. Recently, he was willing to wait. Okay, fine. But part of the reason why anybody logically could say they would wait this year is there was a pretty healthy middle of quarterbacks from number 6 to 12. There was a lot of guys. You know what? I'd be fine getting Michael Vick. I'd be fine getting Phillip Rivers, Tony Romo, what have you. Here's my problem, George. If you wait now, you're dealing with Michael Vick we just discussed. You're dealing with a Tony Romo situation where he doesn't have Miles Austin or Jason Witten for the rest of the preseason, so it's at least a little bit iffy as to what might happen going forward, not to mention the running backs are pretty fragile already. Phillip Rivers, his wide receivers are not impressive to me anyway, and the one guy that I kind of liked, Vincent Brown, he's now out at least half the season with an ankle injury. Peyton Manning has looked reasonable. He took a hit. We've seen that happen. I still haven't seen him whip the ball down the field. He's accurate, but I haven't seen – I wouldn't say that to this moment we've seen him look like, the historical norm Peyton Manning. Ben Roethlisberger is at least getting back Mike Wallace, we believe, this week, so that boosts him up. But I guess my point is all of a sudden that healthy middle is now looking a little more wobbly than it did a couple weeks ago when people were saying they're going to wait. So my question is, from a risk tolerance standpoint, how comfortable are you waiting on quarterback this year compared to maybe what you were thinking a few weeks ago or normally?
I think it really depends on what your league setup is. If you're in a 2 QB league, I think I'm targeting quarterbacks as early as possible. And I think those first three guys, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, and Tom Brady, in any order, if I get any one of those three guys, I know I'm set at the quarterback position. I feel good about it, and then I'll have to deal with, the Michael Vicks and the Tony Romos, the Matt Ryan, the Phillip Rivers question marks. Is Phillip Rivers going to revert to the old Phillip Rivers? But I think at the same time, if you want to wait, that's a pretty good strategy because I think most of these guys, you get as deep as 10 to 12, that range. There are still guys who can be a legitimate QB1 for your fantasy team. Rivers, he could rebound very easily. He's looked pretty good. Even with Brown out, I still think that gives guys like Eddie Royal a chance to step up. And Peyton Manning's going to be pretty solid. You know what you're going to get out of him. So, if you're able to stock up and get a couple more quality running backs or wide receivers, or maybe take a Gronkowski or Jimmy Graham in the first round, I certainly can see waiting on the quarterback. But my personal strategy this year has been to grab Aaron Rodgers, Brees, or Brady if they're available in the first round, and then that really locks up, one of the top 3 fantasy performers out there. I know what I'm getting week in and week out, and then I can sort of take my chances at running back and wide receiver where there's more depth. So there's a lot of upside in the QBs. I'm not saying don't wait, but if you have an opportunity to grab one of those top 3 guys, I definitely do it.
Right. So I think we're on the same page here. Basically, like I said, even if that was my strategy before, look, if I had to wait for whatever the reason, maybe I end up with one of those running backs or Calvin Johnson, I'm fine. I wasn't going to freak out. And I'm not going to freak out now, but at the same point, there's more. I would say that the gap has widened between the top group. You could even put Stafford closer to the top, maybe even Cam Newton, and I think it's widened to these guys. Basically, I think at this point for me, and we're talking, what's today's date, George? The 21st of August?
Yep.
We got, a couple weeks still to go before, so everything's fluid. You got to be flexible. You got to adapt. But right now, I'm thinking, like you said, Rodgers, Brady, Brees. I'll take them. Depending on the scenario, I'll take Stafford. Something tells me I'm not going to get Cam Newton,
right.
but at least that's largely based on the way my leagues work. But if I don't get any of those guys, I'm looking at Matt Ryan, because I didn't mention him before as having any issues, if anything, with his receiving core and the way Atlanta seems to be wanting to throw it more, playing in they've got a really, really great strength of schedule for whatever that's worth relative to last year's world. I think he looks good. And Eli Manning, same situation. Hakeem Nicks is back. He's been practicing. Everything seems to look fine for him to be starting this season. And Eli Manning's has proven to be pretty durable. He's got a late bye. So those are the guys that I'm interested in, relatively speaking. Now here's my in case of emergency break glass plan. Let's say it's totally conceivable. I end up with I have one draft where I have the second pick. Reasonable chance I'm going to end up with Foster or Rice there. It may come around where the quarterbacks are not going to be there for me in rounds 2 or 3, but for all I know, maybe Ryan and Eli are the apple of somebody else's eye, and I miss out on them also. Now, again, for me personally, I don't really want Peyton Manning. I might pass on Rivers. So, George, here's what I'm thinking about doing. I'm liking the Chicago Bears enough right now that even though historically Jay Cutler has not been my boy in any way, shape, or form, I'm liking him. He's got an ADP that puts him down sort of, I think, in the middle of the 8th round, give or take. What I'm thinking is I'm almost okay with waiting, building, stockpiling the running backs and the receivers and so on, waiting to get to him, and then immediately following up after I draft him by drafting RG3 or Andrew Luck, whichever one is still sitting there. That because I think Cutler's got a chance with Brandon Marshall, with the way that offense looks. I think he's got a chance to move into that top 10 this season, and with the going with the young quarterback as the number 2. I'm not saying that those guys I want to count on them week by week, but I think their potential help offsets the fact that I missed out on one of the more obvious guys. And you hope that if you get lucky, they're Cam Newton. Worst case, at least if they're sort of Andy Dalton, you can use them on a week-to-week basis, maybe play the matchups. So I think that's my break the glass in case of emergency plan. What's your take on, be it that, or what's your in case of emergency plan on your end?
Yeah, I think I've seen this a couple times in drafts I've done myself. It's where, you're trying to take the best available player at wherever your pick comes up. And sometimes you'll go through the first 4 or 5 rounds and you really don't have a quarterback. Eli Manning goes the pick before you in the 5th round, and you go, what am I going to do now? It's you got to look at the later options. I think you brought up a couple of good ones. Once you get outside of the 10 range in the FFToolbox rankings, you see the Peyton Mannings, Roethlisberger, Schaub. Then you get the Jay Cutler, RG3, Andy Dalton, Josh Freeman, Andrew Luck. I mean, those guys very easily could slide into that top 10 at the position by the end of the year. So I think if you want to grab, you probably want to grab 2 of them and hope that one of them pops for your team, and then the other one you can probably trade, play the matchups, whatever you want to do. I think if you miss out on those elite quarterbacks, and then you miss out on that 5 to 10 range, I certainly think there are a couple of guys that you can get away with starting them if you're talented enough at running back and wide receiver. I definitely would want Jay Cutler. I think with Brandon Marshall back in the fold, I think he's poised to put up some numbers. Matt Schaub, if he can stay healthy, he's got that foot issue that might still bother him this season. We don't really know, but certainly a lot of weapons there and positive things out of the RG3 and Andrew Luck camp so far. And another guy under the radar is Josh Freeman, who I talked about. I think this guy's poised for a big year. The upgrade on the offensive line, Vincent Jackson's there. Doug Martin's going to be solid in the backfield. He's a guy who struggled with interceptions last year. If he could turn that around, he was a top 10 guy in his rookie year. He could easily do that again, and he's the 17th quarterback off the board right now. I'd feel pretty good about that. So you can definitely wait at all these positions. You're really kind of hoping that you get lucky if you wait on one position, whether it's quarterback, running back, or wide receiver. You really got to pick the right guy. There's almost zero margin for error, but I think there are a couple solid options, and those are the guys I would target.
I'll put you on the spot here with this. I'll go first so you can have a moment to think. At some point here in the next, I think tomorrow I'm going to post online my sort of rules for the road, each position. I'll start with the quarterbacks and talk about some of the things I just went through here, and then later I will kind of put my favorite players, pound for pound across the board, and by that I mean, like the way people used to talk about boxing, or maybe they still do, but boxing is not a topic of conversation much these days. Basically, relatively speaking, everybody's in the same position. You got to factor in, in the case of fantasy, where a guy gets drafted or how much they cost in an auction. Pound for pound, who's your favorite guy? And I kind of blanked. Last year, I'm at quarterback. I'm blanking. Last year, I know a receiver I had Jordy Nelson, meaning even though he was going to get picked late in the draft, I liked his upside enough that I thought, pound for pound, he was the best. At quarterback, as obvious as this sort of sounds, I'm going to say the answer is Aaron Rodgers, and by that I'm acknowledging, yes, it's going to cost me a first-round pick to get the guy, but I still think his potential, his production, is so far above what else I'm going to get, maybe not relative to Brady and Breeze, but when you look at the whole board, not to mention the risk factor, as we've been talking about, incredibly low. Yes, like George said, I mean, he can get hurt. He has been hurt, but, I don't think it's a chronic thing with him the way it is with some of these other guys. And, Cedric Benson there, maybe Green Bay gives a little bit more to the ground game. I'm not that worried about it. And relatively speaking, Green Bay, even though they had, the undefeated stretch there for a long time, I think the way this season ended, they've got something to prove. So I think for me, as silly as it may sound in a certain sense, I'm acknowledging pound for pound, Aaron Rodgers to me is my quarterback, is my favorite quarterback this year, factoring in everything. What about you? Who's your pound for pound top quarterback this year?
Yeah, I'll one up you. I'll go pound for pound, best value and worst value. Obviously, the top three, like you mentioned, those are the guys you want. If you can't get them, which is where I'm going to go, I honestly think it's Josh Freeman. He's the 17th quarterback off the board, according to all of the drafts on FFToolbox.com, the average draft position, going around pick 128. I think he's a guy with top 10 upside where if you miss out on everybody and you need a guy, I think he could fill in and be a solid number one guy for your fantasy team. At least draft him as a backup, and you can definitely trade him or whoever else you're starting. I think he's great insurance if you do end up with a guy like Michael Vick, where he's going to miss a couple games. I think Freeman definitely has the upside to justify that. So I think he's the best value on the board right now. And I think the worst value, honestly, is Cam Newton. Going around pick 14, so that's the second round, end of the late first, early second. Not a huge fan of Cam Newton, and they brought in Mike Tolbert for a reason, and that he's going to take away the goal line carries. I think it's unrealistic to expect Newton to score 14 touchdowns on the ground again this year. Regression's definitely possible. His yards per game passing-wise went down significantly in the second half of last season. I just don't think a repeat is possible, especially when you look at Steve Smith, another year older. Brandon LaFell still a work in progress. We don't really know what Louis Murphy is in that offense. So there's some real question marks with Cam Newton, and I don't think it's a real value taking him in the second round. I don't think he has the upside of a Drew Brees, Tom Brady, or Aaron Rodgers, unless he runs for 15 touchdowns again, which I don't think is going to happen. So, yeah, I like Freeman late, and I'd stay away from Newton early.
Yeah, like I said a few minutes ago, I don't put Newton into the same category I put Vick, with Vick I'm really nervous. With Newton, it's not so much I'm nervous, it's just
it's not a value there.
With him, and I think a lot of it does have to do with scoring. If you're in leagues where quarterbacks get 6 points a touchdown pass, his upside gets cut a little bit because he only threw 21 touchdowns last year. You would logically think that number goes up a little bit, but is it going to go up to the high levels that these
30.
other guys are? What's that?
It's not going to be 30.
Right, and I would, if Brandon LaFell turns into, a legitimate number 2, then maybe, we're all looking at the world a little bit differently. But I'm not confident 100% that could happen. He's an interesting flyer, but I'm not ready to say he's the man. And they're going to obviously run the ball, so. So I'm sort of with you. I'm with you to an extent. That's a bold call to say that he's not good value. I'm just saying I suspect he's not going to be on my team, but I would understand why folks would draft him. All right, George, I'll tell you what. We're gonna put a pin in this for the moment. We're gonna come back, talk about Adrian Peterson, the running backs, some of the receivers, Miles Austin, Jason Witten, and others. But first, I want to bring in one of these guys who is you read his stuff even if maybe you don't even realize it sometimes. He's in all kinds of different fantasy magazines. You've probably been on his website, rosterdoc.com. He also is the founder of Roto Bowl, which is billed as the country's most affordable tournament with high-stakes prizes. Mr. Philadelphia himself, Matthew Falcow. What is happening?
Hey, how's it going, guys? Good to talk to you.
I appreciate you coming on, and we're gonna get some more information out of you in a few minutes about the Roto Bowl and what folks need to know about that. But I wanted to get you on and talk fantasy with you. You told me before the show that you are a Philadelphia guy, which is why I threw that intro in there. And we just talked about Michael Vick a second ago. I think both of us were sort of the opinion that we may rank, Michael Vick may be ranked number 6 in fantasy among quarterbacks, at least in our opinion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I really want him on my team, because I just fear that every week I'm going to be worrying about every single play that he's going to go down, and it makes me nervous. Being somebody who's on top of the scene there, I guess, what's your sense of the severity of this latest injury, and what's your risk tolerance with him going forward?
Well, for me so far, it's kind of an incomplete, only because he's only thrown 5 or 6 passes so far in the preseason, given he's been hurt twice. What's I guess startling is that he's still running around there. He's still leaving himself open. There was major talk, locally at least, in the offseason about how he was going to change up his game a bit, how he was going to become more of a pocket passer, protect himself a little bit more. And it was a back-and-forth thing, and it's just, it could just be a bad coincidence so far, but, if you're going into a fantasy draft now, you have to be incredibly scared to take him, and I think his stock is certainly going down with every pass. I call it incomplete because you haven't really seen what he can do yet. You haven't seen if he's going up. You haven't seen if he's going to make the right throws. If Deshaun Jackson's going to be there for him, and those guys are going to click together. He hasn't had enough time in games yet. But if he was considered fragile before, he's certainly even more than that now. And the backup there, Nick Foles, the rookie, is looking pretty good. The sample size is pretty small. You're probably not going to see him again, of course. He's got a rib injury, no broken ribs, but, those things tend to linger. Word is he'll be on the field for week 1, but, who knows for how long. And I think that if you're going into a fantasy draft now, you might get great value on him because his stock, like I said, is certainly going down. But I certainly would not reach for him, and quarterback is a little bit deeper this year. I'd certainly feel better with a Matt Ryan or an Eli Manning, someone of that caliber, rather than Vick.
A man after my own heart. All right, let's move off of Vick. Let's talk about another guy in the state of Pennsylvania who's in the news today, and that's Mike Wallace, Steelers wide receiver. The buzz is that he is planning to report to Pittsburgh this weekend. That gets him into camp before the season. What kind of shape he is and all that, I guess we'll find out soon enough. The holdout players, I'm sure we've all at some point, especially all of us have dealt with them at one point or the other. A lot of us, obviously, last year suffered through the Chris Johnson debacle. He holds out longer than this, assuming Wallace does report. I think it was a little bit longer, or maybe it's about the same. But regardless, he obviously was never right the whole season. Wide receiver is a little bit different than running back, but nonetheless, it's still a little bit of a concern. Plus, with Pittsburgh, assuming Wallace isn't getting a new contract, which I doubt he is, they've already given all the money to Antonio Brown, so it's kind of a weird, awkward dynamic there. What do you do with a guy like Wallace? Based on talent, he's top 10, top 12, but with all this other going on and considering receivers pretty deep this year, what do you do with a guy like that?
I'm not a big Mike Wallace guy. I never have been. You can go back as recently as last year. Forget about the holdout and Antonio Brown and everything for a minute. Just look at his play on the field. Last year he came out blazing. The first 3 games, he had 300-yard games in a row. He had a couple touchdowns. But from there, it was completely downhill. In the second half of the season, the guy only had 3 touchdowns. His best game after the Arizona game in Week 7 was against the Patriots in their awful secondary. He's just a little too inconsistent for my taste. Pittsburgh still is a running team. Antonio Brown's getting better and better. He'll be able to walk right in after the holdout. assuming he does report. Just because the Steelers don't really have that much. They didn't go out and sign anybody big in the off season, so I mean his spot as a starter is still cemented. But I just don't think he's worthy of a high wide receiver pick. You know, according to the FFToolbox rankings, I think he's going around the Steve Smith, the Jordy Nelson range, which is probably where he belongs. But he's just not a guy I would touch this year. We saw it with Deshaun Jackson. I keep picking on him last year. You know, what a messy contract situation does to a guy's head and a guy's play. And Wallace being primarily a deep threat, he's a guy that can get taken out of the game easily, and a guy that's going to run a lot of decoy routes, run a lot of clear out routes for Antonio Brown. And he's on my avoid list this year.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I'm with you, especially, I mean, you brought up a lot of good reasons, and just again, as we've talked about a lot on the show, once you get past Calvin Johnson, you can make an argument for the next 20 guys, give or take, and feel pretty good, even if any of them landed as your number one receiver on some level. So you don't have to take him would be the point. Don't feel just because he's ranked 10, you know, take 11, take 12, or beyond that, you know, take a running back in that round and somebody else will take him, and then you can deal with the receiver later or what have you. Don't feel compelled to have to take a risk on a guy in a year like this when you have so many options out there. Let me ask you about one other player before we get to the tournament talk. MJD. I thought when you and I talked earlier in the day about you coming on that we were going to discuss MJD. Some positive news that potentially it looked like he might be coming back based on some rumors that it was finally going to turn the corner on that. Well, as I'm getting ready here and looking at some things now, Adam Schefter is saying that MJD is open to being traded. That's in quotes, quote unquote, open to being traded, in light of his owner saying something along the lines of the train is leaving the station, I guess, with regarding the contract. So all of a sudden, that doesn't sound terribly interesting. Take out these specifics aside, if MJD is still not in camp by the time your draft comes around, are you remotely touching him?
I don't think you can for a few reasons. Of course, what you just mentioned, again, a guy that's missed all of camp and will certainly not be able to run back in there. But MJD, number one, he's always an injury risk. Number two, if he comes back and does not get traded, he's still playing in Jacksonville where your quarterback is Blaine Gabbert or Chad Henne. That team's going to take a lot of time, would be an understatement, to start rolling. But most importantly, I really like Rashard Jennings. Every time he's been called on, he comes through. He averages over 5 yards a carry. He always has. I think he's a guy that's ready to take the ball and do a lot more with it. I think he's in line for a lot more carries, whether Maurice Jones-Drew is there or not. If he gets traded, it depends on where he goes. The early rumor I heard was Atlanta. But I mean, at this point, to just come back in with all the turmoil, no, he's a guy I would definitely avoid, even if he's there at the end of your first round, which is probably where he's going right now. I don't know how you can touch him. There's just too many question marks and too much downside to spend an early pick on a guy like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and as we've talked about it before, you want to get obviously the best player you can, but minimizing risk is almost right there, as the co-factor in the decision, and that's going to be a lot of risk. I mean, even if he comes in next week, as we talked about with Mike Wallace, I mean, the guy's coming in off of holdouts, especially if he's disgruntled and doesn't get a new deal, it just comes in. It's going to make me nervous. There's already a bunch of other running backs who are going to make me nervous. I'd rather, at least in that case, go with Darren McFadden, even if his injury potential again makes me nervous. He's there. He's looking good. Matt Forte, he's got a new deal. He's looking good. Jamal Charles is playing. He's coming off an injury, but he's looking reasonable. Even DeMarco Murray, a guy that I'm not that high on just because he makes me nervous with his fragility, but he's playing. I'll take my chance that those guys play 15, 16 than MJD does or doesn't. All right, well let's get to the Roto Bowl, because I know a little bit about this from having talked to you. We've had a bunch of other guys come on over the last few weeks to talk about some of the other tournaments that FF Toolbox is helping to sponsor as part of the Fantasy Football World Championships, and the Roto Bowl is part of that. A lot of the stuff we've talked about have been sort of on the higher end of the fees. This is maybe something that maybe most people can sort of gravitate towards. Give us a sense of what Roto Bowl is all about.
Well, we pretty much complete the puzzle, I think, for the FF Toolbox offerings. You have the FSWC, which is the highest of the high stakes. That one's about $1,500. If you do it online, $1,740. If you do it live to enter, and you get $200,000 for the top prize there. They also have a mid stakes, which goes down to $500, and then the Roto Bowl comes in, and our entry fee is $259. You win $25,000 for first place. Of course, you pay out overalls. Just like the other tournaments, it's the same format. You're in an individual league of 12. You get $1,050 for winning that. You get $350 for second. It's pretty much completing the puzzle. We're offering now a high stakes, a mid stakes, and now we call it a low stakes. So there's something for everybody. We're really excited about it. We've grown in popularity each year. We're really excited to be a part of the FF Toolbox team here, and we're really looking forward to it.
And it's both, people can do this both online and in Las Vegas, is that right?
Yes, there's going to be live drafts in Las Vegas. Online draft starts this Sunday, August 26th. Registration is still open for both. You can still draft a team on any of the tournaments, and it's going to be great. We're really pumped up about it.
Awesome, Matthew. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about that and giving us the Philly insight on Mr. Vick and all that good stuff. What's the best place for folks to find you out there in the world? Is it Roster Doc? Is it somewhere else? Where's the best place to find you out there?
Well, rosterdoc.com is our salary cap game. You can always find me there. You can see me in a couple magazines each year, rotobowl.com, of course, and then FF Toolbox. We're coming strong with the live drafts, and we're really excited about the season.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. We'll talk soon, and, you heard it here first. Michael Vick, don't do it.
Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good night.
All right, Matt. See you later.
Take care.
All right, George. Let's get back on the horse here. We are, for those of you who are listening live, we're not doing the full Monty of a show here. No hour and a half, 2 hours. We're going to have to cut it after an hour. If I can convince George or Brian to come back on Thursday, we'll see what we can do. But for now, let's go through some of the other stuff. Adrian Peterson, let's get back to the risk talk. Adrian Peterson, the buzz today is that he is not going to play the remainder of the preseason. When I say buzz, I mean that is apparently what is being said in Minnesota, that he's not going to play the rest of the preseason. That means, George, if you go into a draft with the plans of taking Adrian Peterson, you're taking a guy coming off a big knee injury not that long ago, relatively speaking, got hurt late in the season last year, so it's not even close to being a full year of recovery. And you'd be having to likely draft him in the second round to secure him. I think a couple months ago I was living under the assumption that he really was Superman and thinking, you know what, if he's talking about coming back, who am I to say he can't? I'm leaning towards saying I don't see me taking him. If I pick first or second and get Foster and Rice, and Peterson is there for me at the end, at the turn, maybe, I don't know. I could see me maybe rolling the dice. And by the way, if I do take Peterson, I'm jumping in on getting Toby Gerhardt as soon as possible. Like in the sixth round or somewhere in that range, even if he's my third back, so to speak. But in a general sense, my risk tolerance is not going to be terribly high on Peterson. And more to the point, I suspect somebody else in my league or most leagues is going to just jump all in, unless the reports really change over the next few days. So for me, I just don't see me having Peterson, sort of like the way I feel about Vick. I'm not totally shying away, but I don't see me having him, and I'm really hoping somebody else takes him before I do.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You look at Adrian Peterson, he only had the surgery in December, right after he suffered the injury. So it's only been about 6-7 months, 8 months at the most. 8 months since the surgery. You're really taking a lot of risk there, picking him in the second round. But at the same time, I can understand it. Let's just throw it out there. For example, let's say you take Aaron Rodgers 4th overall, and You look at the average draft position right now, Adrian Peterson at pick 21, so that's late in the second round. I mean, if he's sitting there, it's hard to pass that kind of production up. He may not be the same Adrian Peterson we're used to seeing, but you know the guy's going to get his touches. He's going to score at least 10 touchdowns. He's going to get close to 1,000 yards. I think that's pretty safe. I think now it's pretty clear cut, especially with the latest news about Maurice Jones-Drew today and about his holdout and where the road that might be headed down. There's a clear cut top 5 or 6 guys. Arian Foster, Ray Rice, and LeSean McCoy are the safest guys. And then with Chris Johnson, the strong preseason he's having, and then Matt Forte always being solid, I think those are your top 5 guys. And then Darren McFadden's right there at 6. He's going to be gone by the end of the first round. Somebody will take that risk on him actually staying healthy. It won't be me again this year, but someone will. So then you reach Maurice Jones-Drew, DeMarco Murray, Jamal Charles, who's actually looked good coming off an injury, Trent Richardson, Marshawn Lynch, Adrian Peterson. Once you hit that range, I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen with any of those guys. I mean, there's no guarantees there with any of them, but I definitely think the most talented guy of that group is Adrian Peterson. So I have no problem with taking that risk in the second round. It's hard to doubt this guy. If he wasn't healthy enough to play, he wouldn't be out there. The medical staff or Peterson would shut it down. So I think as long as he's out there, he's going to be good to go, and I think he's going to be productive, and I think he's pretty good value in the late second if he's the anything like the old Adrian Peterson out on the field.
All right. New risk question. One of the tricky parts is when you look at running backs, it's not just, okay, most of it we're looking at, okay, I think over the course of the year this player is going to do X and therefore I like him here or there, whatever it might be. But there's other guys who out of the box have a sort of an odd value because they may be starting early on, but that may last 2 weeks, it may last 4 weeks, it may last 8, it may last the whole season. We don't quite know. And the question is then, sort of how do you figure out the value for these guys? And one guy in particular I'm talking about is Kevin Smith with the Lions. When Kevin Smith plays, wow, does he look good? If he could play a full season at the level he looks at the times of the Lions, he would be a borderline, starting RB1 or at least a high RB2. Of course, the issue with him is twofold. One, he's got his own injury history. He can't seem to stay on the field. I mean, at the moment, at least, he seems to be okay, unless something's changed in the last 10 minutes and with his breakable bones and whatnot. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me too much. But then the thing with Detroit is, Javid Best, it looks like he may be ending up on the PUP list, which would take him out half the year. Mikel LaShore dealing with injuries and potential suspension. He's going to probably miss at least a couple of games. So the question is, what do you do with a guy like Kevin Smith? Now, here's what I'm thinking, George. He's not terribly high on my radar simply because I prefer to draft a guy. I mean, he's going his ADP is currently 94, so I think we said so that puts him somewhere around the 8th round. I mean that's not a horrible imposition if you take him, but you could probably get some other players in that range who are going to be there for the whole year. For example, ADP right after him, Ben Tate, Stephen Ridley. Those guys. I mean, I know Ridley, you and I both have an affection for, or we'll get to him in a second. But those guys are in theory going to be around most of the year. I mean, Ridley's injury isn't significant, the one he suffered the other day. But Smith, in terms of his short-term value, I mean, he could be a top 20 back early on. So what I'm thinking is, if I do end up with a guy like Adrian Peterson, or maybe I end up with a Marshawn Lynch who's likely to miss a couple of games because of a suspension, or maybe Trent Richardson, who also could miss time, or maybe I do end up with MJD somehow, then I see me maybe going with Kevin Smith maybe a little bit earlier than I might normally because I'm going to actually use him early on. But if he's just going to be there for pure depth, then I might look for somebody who's going to be there, I think, the long haul. And because ultimately for me, I kind of think LaShore long haul is the best bet on Detroit because I just don't trust Kevin Smith's health. So I just said a lot of stuff there about Kevin Smith. What do you think about him? How do you kind of handle a guy like him who sort of has fluctuating value right off the bat?
It depends on how your roster is shaping up. I think you hit the nail on the head with it depends. Do you need Kevin Smith to play, or is he just another guy on your bench that you're going to hold on to and you don't really need him right away? If you're set at running back, let's say you go Matt Forte and You grab Doug Martin or Reggie Bush in the third or fourth round there. I think you're set. You have a couple of guys where you're not going to need to worry about their health or right at the start of the year, and you're not going to worry about, I don't need Kevin Smith to play, so why would I take him? I think in that range, you mentioned a couple of the guys going right before him, Mark Ingram, Ben Tate, David Wilson, who's going a couple picks after him. Those are guys who I think are more intriguing over the course of the entire 16-game season, where if there's an injury to an Arian Foster, or Ingram steps up and takes that job, and it really becomes a goal line, back to the Saints, or David Wilson has a breakout campaign there with the two-headed system in New York with Ahmad Bradshaw. I mean, those are guys who could have a bigger impact by the end of the year. Obviously, Stephen Ridley could have the job week one. Then Kevin Smith, who we know at some point is going to have some sort of injury. It may not be a major injury, but Kevin Smith always seems to have, when it's not a knee injury or something like that, it's always like a nagging injury or something like that that keeps him out of action or makes him a game-time decision. So I think if you need Kevin Smith to play right away, based on how your roster is shaping up on draft day, I think he's the guy to have the most immediate impact. But over the course of 16 games, I think there's a lot of other guys I'd like to draft in that range than Kevin Smith. So that's just me. I'm kind of staying away from the Lions' backfield situation this year. It's a little too crowded, and you really don't know about all three of those guys, much less one of them.
I think two other guys that sort of fit into the same category, but in slightly different ways. Isaac Redman with the Steelers, Mark Ingram with the Saints. Ingram, I mean, obviously Darren Sproles is the guy there right now, but, I mean, they did spend the number one pick on him a year ago. It's hard to imagine he's just going to get completely buried, but at the same point, he didn't look that good last year. Now, in his case, like you said, if I already feel pretty secure with my two running backs and I don't need Kevin Smith right off the bat, I might go instead for a guy like Ingram where I'm shooting for the moon, hoping he becomes the legit guy on a team that's got a crazy offense. And so I might go that way. Whereas, again, if I need somebody right off the bat, his role is a lot less defined, so I probably would go with Kevin Smith if I needed somebody right away. Another guy who's sort of a hybrid of both of that is Isaac Redman with Pittsburgh, because Rashard Mendenhall, they took him off. Pittsburgh took him off the PUP list, so I mean he's not definitely out half the year. But at the same point, nobody's expecting him back for a few weeks. Now, Redmond's had his own little dings here during preseasons. From what I gather, it's not anything overly serious. Feel free to correct me, George, if I missed something on that. But the question is, so again, Pittsburgh running back, that's a pretty nice thing to have. He could be really strong for a few weeks, but then if Mendenhall comes back, it could be a split. Maybe Mendenhall takes over if he's good to go. Maybe Redmond just is the guy. It's not, again, I'm kind of shying away from that. I would maybe treat it like the Kevin Smith if I felt like I needed something else right away. Maybe I'd go with him, but I'm not dying to get involved with him either. He's right a little before Kevin Smith, and Ingram is right before Kevin Smith also. Do you have a feel for either Redmond or Ingram one way or the other?
Yeah, I don't think anyone really knows what the upside of Isaac Redmond is. I don't think he's going to develop into an elite-type guy. I think when you look at Mark Ingram, he's a guy who could jump into that next class. He's a big guy. He could dominate the carries inside the red zone, easily have a major fantasy impact. I don't really know how good Isaac Redmond actually is. And then there's the questions of, Rashard Mendenhall, even if he misses a month, he's back into the mix, and they're going to try and get him up to speed. So that takes away his value as well. I think he's a stay-away guy for me, especially when you have to pick him in the 8th, 9th round. I'm not really that intrigued at all about Isaac Redmond. I just don't see the upside there. On the other hand, I do think Ingram has potential to be, one of those top 20 guys where you can get him at a late value. I think that's one of the reasons you can kind of get away with waiting on running backs this year. There's a lot of questions at the top, but I mean there is some good value in that 25 to 40 range where there are guys like Donald Brown and Peyton Hillis and Stephen Ridley. Guys like that available that you can plug in, and they're probably going to have a major fantasy value at some point this year. So a lot of value there. I just don't think Redmond is one. I just really don't see the upside there with him.
All right. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so here's what we're going to do, George. We're going to go through a bunch of names. We're going to do it really quick. Relatively speaking, is somebody worth the risk, or are you staying away? If you need to qualify it, you can quickly, but that's what we're doing. You ready?
All right, let's do it.
All right, Miles Austin continues to miss time with the Cowboys. I think it's a pulled hamstring. He's had some injuries before. Again, relative because there's so many receivers out there. To me, it's a stay-away situation. I will take him, but I don't need to. So it's going to be a stay-away for me right now.
Yeah, same thing for me. I mean, there's a couple guys going in that range that I'd rather have. Dwayne Bowe's, Antonio Brown's of the world. I'd rather have those guys than Miles Austin right now. Just too many questions. And Des Bryant's still going to be there without Jason Witten. I'm staying away from Miles Austin right now.
All right. So we've got we've made some adjustments with regards to our FFToolbox rankings this week. Andre Johnson back in the lineup. We bumped him back up to number 5 overall in standard scoring after dropping him down to 8. Look, I continue to say if he's healthy, I don't know who outside of Calvin Johnson I would say I'm going to take over Andre Johnson, although he's on the wrong side of 30. And his touchdowns are not historically his thing, but, certainly crazy talented. So as the number 5 receiver, George, is he worth the risk? Or are you staying away?
I'm staying away from Andre Johnson just because he really hasn't been an elite guy in a couple of years. I don't think I'd want to draft him that high. There's a couple other guys in that range who I'd rather have. On the average draft position, he's the 5th guy off the board. I'd rather have A.J. Green, Roddy White, Greg Jennings, maybe it's a stretch, but maybe, Victor Cruz and Brandon Marshall. I mean, those are the next 5 guys off the board at wide receiver, and I think they're all safer bets than Andre Johnson. He's going to go early because he's a name value, but I really don't see the upside there. He's not ever going to be totally healthy, and that's something you can't risk, especially when there are better guys like Green and White there available after him.
Oh, you know what? Hold on. Before I take back what I just said. We still have him at number 8. I was actually looking at his ADP. With that said, I was advocating for him to go back to 5, so what I was saying is still reasonable. I still do kind of think he's worth that spot, but I'm not saying that, like you said, I mean, look, in a general sense at receiver this year, outside of Calvin Johnson, I'll take somebody if they're the best guy on the board, but between taking Gronkowski or Graham, between taking one of the handful of running backs who I might feel comfortable with, I have and can see me continuing to wait on receiver until the 3rd round, the 4th round, and so on. And realistically, Andre Johnson's probably not going to be there that late. So even though I think he's worth that spot, I just suspect on some general level, I guess I'm sort of in the middle. I think he's worth the risk, but odds are I'm staying away because of my overall receiver strategy. Let's go over to tight end. We haven't touched on them. Antonio Gates. Look, I mean, Graham and Gronkowski, everybody's got them way above the rest of the world. I think that's a reasonable take. If you're going to pick one guy who would potentially catch him, you'd probably say Gates, considering, one, he's always productive when he's healthy. 2, San Diego doesn't have much else to go to right now, so Phil Rivers is going to look for him an awful lot. But, tight end's one of those positions. If you draft the guy and he does get hurt, it's a lot harder to fill that void. Unless you just happen to have drafted, unless you took another high guy in your draft, you can't just get somebody off the street to even get remote value. So is Antonio Gates for you, George, worth the risk, or are you staying away?
I think he's worth the risk. I think there's a clear-cut top 4 guys at the tight end position, and honestly, I find myself taking one of those 4 guys. I'm not a big fan of waiting on tight ends this year. I know a lot of people will say, the depth is there, and you can get Fred Davis or Jacob Tamme, Jared Cook, Owen Daniels, Greg Olsen in the last round, those type of guys. But honestly, I think tight end has evolved to the point where I'd rather have Jimmy Graham, Rob Gronkowski, Antonio Gates, or even Aaron Hernandez over anybody else because you give yourself such an advantage at that position. I think the best value's got to be Aaron Hernandez. He's a guy who the Patriots have started to use more as a wide receiver than an actual tight end so far during the training camp and the preseason. So I think he's a guy who's going to put up monster numbers, especially maybe next year if you look into the future. When Welker leaves, he might take over that sort of slot role. But, yeah, Gates definitely worth the value. Not a lot of competition for red zone targets in San Diego. I think he lives up to, being the 3rd best tight end out there and being, one of the top, 5-round pick. I think he definitely lives up to that.
And just to be, the show, I'm kind of with you. I've talked up the tight end notion of taking Graham Gronkowski early in the only draft I've done where we're actually playing out the season that I've actually done so far. In the second round, I had the fourth pick of the second round. Jimmy Graham was already off the board, and I did go with Gronkowski over every receiver not named Calvin Johnson. I could have taken any other receiver. They were all sitting there. I went Gronkowski because of the reasons you just said. If you end up waiting, if you end up missing on tight end, it's not a disaster. You can get guys, some of the guys George said, plus like a Brandon Pettigrew, and I really like Jared Cook. But, yeah, I really do think there's a difference with the high-end guys. And just as far as Gates specifically, I think it's all within relative, if I'm somewhere in the fifth round and that we've already gotten to the point where, I don't know, maybe I have one running back, and at that point the rest of the running backs to me are probably not going to be that interesting. Maybe I've already got my quarterback. I've got two receivers. Gates may be the best guy there, and I'm going to be fine with taking it because if he can stay healthy, play 13 to 16 at least. I mean, that's going to be as close as I'm going to get to Graham and Gronkowski, and I think those guys are a big difference. So I think I'm with you, but I'm not going to go into the third round and take them just because those guys go in the second, if that's how it works. Last guy here, Jason Witten. Normally, the thing about Witten is the guy plays every week, no matter what happens, and he's, some years he's a monster, some years he's at least pretty good. But now he's got this spleen injury. Sounded kind of ugly at first. At least now they're saying it's not the worst thing in the world, but he's going to probably miss the rest of the preseason. And it's certainly kind of an iffy kind of a thing. He'd already fallen back to about number 7 or 8 among tight ends. What do you think about him? Risk worth going for, or are you risk adverse on this guy?
I think I'd rather have a guy like Brandon Pettigrew than Jason Witten based on where they're going, but I definitely think Jason Witten's worth it. The thing with this type of injury is it's not like a hamstring injury or a turf toe, one of those injuries that tends to linger and last with a guy for a while. I think this is one where if Witten sits out and he gets healthy, it's not going to be a concern really ever again. Hopefully, you'd think. It's not like a concussion, something like that that's recurring. He just needs to take some time away and get healthy. So I think you can get away with, getting a guy late like a Kobe Fleener or a Greg Olsen, starting them for the first couple of weeks of the season, like you would do with a guy like Kevin Smith at running back. And then when Jason Witten comes back, he's good to go. So even if he misses some time, I still think Jason Witten's worth it. I trust the guy. He's been consistent. Outside of this injury, I mean, he's only missed one game in his first 8 seasons. So, I like Witten. I think he's definitely worth the value. Anytime you get a guy who's that consistent and you know what you're getting, it's a good pick anytime.
All right, that's going to have to do it for us. I've got to run to a draft that don't even know what kind of league it is, so don't do this at home, kids. This is what I tell you not to do. Know your league before you get in there, but I'll figure out if it's PPR or not in 4 seconds. In any event, appreciate you guys listening. Thanks to Matthew Falcow for calling in. Thanks to George Bissell. As always, if I can get these guys on the ball, we'll see about another show this week. If not, we'll be back next week for sure. And, of course, any comments, questions, hit us up at podcast@fftoolbox.com. Throw it up there on Facebook, on our Facebook page. Hit me up on Twitter at Ben Standig, and hit us up on Twitter also on the site at FFToolbox. Until next time, George.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather.
I mean, nothing is going to keep him out of the lineup, or at least not out of week 1 of the NFL season. But, this is the fear with him. And the question, I guess, is, what's your ultimate risk tolerance for certain guys? Because it's not just a matter of where they're ranked, but it's like, do you actually want to deal with that? And so, George, let's just start right there with Michael Vick. Like I said, he's probably number 6 on our board. I think that's probably reasonable because with his potential, with his run-pass combination. wouldn't if he can make it through most of the year, play most of the games, it wouldn't surprise any of us. I don't think if he's in one of the top 3 or 4 quarterbacks in fantasy, and thus one of the a handful of best players in the league. But there's a lot that goes with having that guy. Is he the kind of guy that you want to hang your hat on this year?
Oh, I kind of was really high on Michael Vick last year. I don't know if you remember around this time last year, I said you should take Vick number 1. As soon as you can, if you have the ability to get him, I would get him. And I live by my own advice, and I suffered through last season along with a lot of other Michael Vick owners. And, that's the risk you take. I mean, any player could get injured at any given time. Doesn't matter who you are. The best example of that is Tom Brady when he went down in week 1 back a couple of years ago. I want to say it was 2008, but it can happen to anybody. But
look up his ADP. I forgot to do that during the show. If not, I'll do it. But relatively speaking, Michael Vick is going to go in the 4th round, 5th round. I guess it just sort of depends on the draft. He could go, depending on scoring, could go earlier or later. Just assume for these purposes, we're talking about 12-team standard scoring leagues. It's not just that you're spending that pick on him. If I'm drafting Michael Vick, I'm not going to wait that long to get a backup quarterback. I'm not saying I'm going to draft another quarterback the next round, but I'm not going to wait till the 12th the way I might if I draft Tom Brady or Drew Brees, or a guy like Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, Eli Manning, 3 guys who have pretty late buys, so I can kind of wait and see what happens. I kind of have to. I feel like you have to invest another quarterback relatively early on Vick, so that's another part of the equation when it comes to do I want to deal with this guy. The other thing is, like you said, I mean, I suffered through him last year, and depending on the size of your league, I'm in a league it's only a 14-man roster, so I had to constantly juggle my roster all year to deal with not only Vick but the backup quarterback, and then at one point the backup I had, I think it was, well, it doesn't matter, I don't remember who it was, but regardless, the quarterback had a bye week while Vick was out, so then I had to get another quarterback, and there's so much that goes on with him. I guess in the end of the day, I've moved down on Vick. I agree he's ranked 6th, and I was thinking about it as I was going through some some readers' questions on Facebook and on the mailbox at podcast@fftoolbox.com. And the most basic question you get there, and I get out in the real world, I'm sure you do as well, is, so what are your rankings on this guy? Where do you have this guy ranked? What do you think? Who do you like more between this guy and that guy? And questions along those lines. And what sort of struck me about the whole thing when it comes to rankings, if I just say, well, I personally think, Michael Vick is the number 6 quarterback, or FFToolbox has him number 6, whatever. Then if I give out no other information, they think, okay, well, he's the number 6 quarterback. If the top 5 guys go and I think I need a quarterback, boom, take Michael Vick, right? But to me, I think we need next year maybe I'm going to push to have some sort of an arrow indicator on our rankings that go up or down, because a guy like Vick, who, if you did, for those of you who are catching this, maybe live now or haven't been up to date on what's going on in football, Michael Vick and the Eagles played Monday night against Georgia's Patriots. Not surprisingly, Michael Vick took a big hit because that's what he does. He doesn't seem to like to get out of harm's way, and got knocked out of the game. Reports today he's got a minor rib injury.
Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Hey, welcome everybody to the latest edition of the FF Toolbox podcast, coming to you live Tuesday, a little bit earlier than we do it normally. It's 7 o'clock. I've got a draft to get to later, so, the price you pay for doing too many drafts, you sometimes got to move shows around, but fortunately, my boy George Bissell was able to hop on. I gave Brian the week off so he could rest his choppers over there, because he's been talking so long in a good way for helping me out here for weeks and weeks. And we got to get George. George is a bit of a training camp holdout for us, so we got to get him up to speed for the regular season. Before we get to George, before we talk later about what's the latest on Michael Vick, on Mike Wallace, and others, just a reminder, we are, of course, sponsored by DynastyOwner.com. Go there, check them out. New formatting on how to do the fantasy football world. They only have a relative amount of spots available, So go there, check them out at dynastyowner.com. You guys have heard me talk about them a bunch on here. George, let's just jump right into this. I was trying to think what to talk about. We've gone through all the positions.
It just feels like with Michael Vick, you're always going to be dealing with an injury issue thanks to his style of play. So that's something you got to take into account before you draft him. It really depends on where Vick goes in the draft. Like you were talking about earlier, it's really, do I want to take the risk on this guy and is it worth it? And I think to go by your rankings, you have to have a tier system. And it depends what you think Vick's upside is versus, the downside and how much risk you're willing to take there. So I think if he's still sitting there in the 4th or 5th round, I have to seriously think about it if I don't have a quarterback. Obviously, if I get a Brady or a Rodgers, Breeze, Cam Newton even, I'm not worried about Michael Vick. I'm not even thinking about it. But I think he's a pretty solid bet given the upside, but you got to think he's going to miss at least 3 games this year, right off the top. So it's definitely a risk, and I think if he's the last guy in my tier and there's a drop-off, I'm going to reach and take him if I don't have a guy already. But you got to take a lot of risk in taking Michael Vick. I wouldn't feel good about it unless it were the 4th or 5th round. And even then, you're kind of reaching and hoping the upside plays out.
So here's my thinking on this. It's not just. Let's just suppose, and George, if you got your computer handy,